Page 1. Is the Reagan Revolution consistent with Jewish ethical values? Adam Meyerson, Washington Hebrew Congregation, February 19, 1986. Thank you. I understand that 2 different invitations went out for this dinner, each with a different title for my remarks. The first is, what's a nice Jewish boy doing at a place like the Heritage Foundation? A question I imagine my mother frequently asks. How did we fail? I can hear her saying, here he grew up in a good Jewish family in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, no less. He went to a good liberal college. He marched in all the right marches. How does he end up working for a conservative think tank? I'll address this question tangentially, but I'll be dealing mostly with the second subject. Is the Reagan Revolution consistent with Jewish ethical values? The Jewish tradition, especially the reformist tradition represented by this congregation, places a strong emphasis on charity and compassion toward the needy, on resolving disputes by negotiation if possible rather than warfare, on the civil, political, and human rights of men and women everywhere, on toleration of people of different faiths, races, and nations, and on the sanctity of life. These values, both the insistence on individual rights and the strong emphasis on man's obligation to his fellow man, derive ultimately from perhaps the most revolutionary idea in the entire Bible, the idea that man is created in the image of God. Page 2. This evening, I hope to use the perspective of these values to examine the record of the Reagan administration and the conservative political agenda, and to explore some of the fears many in the Jewish community have about people like me. Actually, it is not at all unusual for a Jew to be working at the Heritage Foundation. Several key members of top management are Jewish, and I would estimate that as much as a quarter of the professional research staff is Jewish. I have worked at Heritage for 2.5 years without ever once experiencing the slightest innuendo of anti-Semitism. It is an organization where Catholics, evangelical Christians, mainline Protestants, Mormons, Jews, and even a Japanese Buddhist work comfortably side by side. My job at Heritage is to edit the Foundation's quarterly magazine, Policy Review. The chairman of the magazine's editorial board is the economist David Meiselman. Some of you may know his wife Winnie, who runs an organization here in Washington called the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting, or CAMERA. As the name suggests, CAMERA keeps tabs on errors and biases in coverage of Israel by newspapers and television. Maurice is a member, and I am sure he can give you information about it. If you will permit a brief commercial, I would like to read a few excerpts from an article in the current issue of Policy Review. It is by Senator Jesse Helms, and it is based on his recent trip with Senator Sheikh Hecht of Nevada to dedicate the Hecht Synagogue on Mount Scopus overlooking Jerusalem. Page 3. Those of you who think Senator Helms is anti-Semitic or hostile to Israel are going to have to re-examine your assumptions. Israel, he writes, is really our only reliable ally in the Middle East. Only Israel can oppose Soviet hegemony over the entire area. Elsewhere he explains why he, a Baptist deacon, would feel comfortable attending the dedication of a synagogue. Well, the Jewish people worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the last time I checked in the Bible, that's the same God I worship. Any of you would like copies of this article, please see me afterwards. Now, this article by Senator Helms did not appear by accident. It is part of a campaign by conservatives to erase the perception that conservative political principles are code words for racial and religious bigotry. Conservatives today are making special efforts to appeal to all Americans, whatever their racial, ethnic, or religious background. This was not always the case, but it is today, and there has been some remarkable success in bridge building. To cite a few examples. In 1984, Ronald Reagan won 60% of the Catholic vote, even though Catholics have historically felt excluded from the Republican Party. Reagan won 40% of the Hispanic vote. And those of you who live in Maryland will soon be hearing a great deal from Linda Chavez. Page 4. A Mexican-American who is running for Mac Mathias' Senate seat as a conservative Republican. Incidentally, Linda's husband, Chris Gersten, is a former AIPAC lobbyist who now heads the National Jewish Coalition, an organization that is trying to build bridges between Jews and the new right. Though conservatives have generally been unsuccessful winning black support, there is a strong chance that the first black ever to be elected as a state governor will be a conservative Republican. Watch the campaign of Bill Lucas in Michigan this year. Only a third of the Jewish community, however, voted for President Reagan in 1984. I believe that Jewish opposition to Reagan conservatism is based on 4 issues. First, many Jews are upset by Reagan's modest cutbacks of welfare state spending, cutbacks that confirm their suspicion that conservatives don't care very much about the plight of the needy. Second, many Jews think the Reagan administration has been buttressing right-wing dictators with appalling human rights records. Third, Jews overwhelmingly support legalization of abortion in almost all circumstances, a position diametrically opposed to that of Reagan and many other conservatives. And fourth, most Jews are alarmed by the alliance between Reagan conservatives and the new Christian right. They are worried that calls for more religious speech in public places will lead to a Christianization of America and perhaps to a resurgence of persecution of religious. Shocking about so many inner-city public schools is the attitude toward academic achievement. Page 7. Often winners of academic awards have to go to private ceremonies because they would be heckles and hooted down at public assemblies. Friends of mine who tutor gifted students in Washington's Higher Achievement Program, or HAP, tell me that even there, anyone who raises his hand to answer a question is laughed at. No wonder hundreds of thousands of students graduate from high school every year without being able to read and write, and that's not even counting the dropouts. And if you can't read or write, you can't earn a living legally in this economy. It is no accident that 2/3 of the inmates at Lorton Penitentiary are illiterate. Perhaps the most tragic form of self-destruction is the total collapse of forethought and responsibility in the raising of children. I am thinking of the man on Bill Moyer's show about the family, who sees no reason why he should be responsible for the 6 children he has fathered by different women. And I am thinking of those unmarried, uneducated mothers in Leon Dash's superbly reported Washington Post series on teenage pregnancy. There is no way that most of these girls are going to be able to provide for their children without being permanently dependent on the state. It's not impossible for a single mother to bring up children successfully. We all know women who have done it. It's just incredibly difficult, especially when you are already poor. Page 8. And the fact that 80% of the births in many poor neighborhoods are illegitimate is a sign that men and women are simply not thinking about the kind of life they can provide their children. It is hard to imagine a surer recipe for continuing poverty. The availability of welfare programs may not actually cause this poverty, but it does encourage continuing dependency. And it is becoming distressingly clear that the welfare state is failing to provide hope and opportunity to a vast portion of America's poverty population. When Franklin Roosevelt set up the New Deal, when John F. Kennedy set up the New Frontier, when Lyndon Johnson set up the Great Society, their goal was to end dependency. They wanted massive but temporary spending programs that would get people off the dole and on their feet. It worked in the New Deal, but it's not working now, and it's time to go back to the drawing boards in redesigning the welfare state. Let me illustrate with a few tragic statistics from 1980. 42% of black children living in poverty, 44% of black adults unable to read or write beyond 4th grade level, 24% unemployment among black men in their early 20s. This last figure is more distressing than the even higher unemployment for black teenagers, for if you can't get work in your early 20s, you probably will never enter the labor market. I remind you, these figures all come from 1980. The crisis in the welfare state preceded the Reagan cutbacks and was not caused by them. Page 9. Let me close discussion of this subject on a note of hope. The story of the Vietnamese refugees, who arrived on our shores only a few years ago, is an example of the welfare state working at its best. Most of these refugees had lost all their possessions. They spoke no English. Many had loved ones who had perished in the flight from communism. Federal, state, and local governments gave the refugees generous welfare aid to help them ease their transition to this strange new land. And today, thanks to their extraordinary courage and hard work, but also to the government assistance that was initially given their families, Vietnamese children are the leading academic achievers in California schools. Similar stories can be told of millions of other immigrants, and of the many blacks who have worked their way into the middle class by taking advantage of SBA loans or college scholarships or other special breaks provided by government that give the poor a first step onto the ladder of opportunity. Providing this kind of opportunity represents liberalism at its best, and most conservatives have joined liberals in favoring programs that provide a helping hand toward genuine self-sufficiency. At the same time, I think it would be a terrible mistake for liberals to quarrel with the objective, that President Reagan set forth in his State of the Union message. It is time to reshape our welfare system so that it can be judged by how many Americans it makes independent of welfare. Page 10. To be frank, I'm not sure that either liberals or conservatives have the answer for how to achieve this through government policy. Much of the answer, I suspect, will come from greater attention to community self-help and to some old-fashioned ideas, such as the idea that unmarried 15-year-old girls and boys should not be having babies and probably should not even be having sex, and that men and women should take personal responsibility for the consequences of their actions. Let me turn now to questions of foreign policy and defense. What I am about to say may sound facetious, but it is not. I regard the United States Defense Department as our country's single most important charitable institution. And when we shift a few percentage points of our national budget from domestic social spending to the Pentagon, we are shifting from one charitable purpose to another. The recipients of our defense charity, however, are not simply the citizens of the United States. They are the citizens of the world. What I mean by calling the Pentagon a charitable institution is very simple. The United States currently spends much more on defense than would be necessary to protect the lives and liberties of our own citizens. Instead, more than any other country in the world, the United States has committed itself to defending free societies everywhere. Our goal has been to make sure that the Soviet Union cannot do to Western Europeans and Japanese and Israelis and Nicaraguans what it has done to Andrei Sakharov and Lech Walesa and Anatoly Sharansky, and in this goal we have been largely successful. Page 11. It is by no means clear that France or Italy or Japan or even Israel would be a free society today without the military protection, including the nuclear umbrella of the United States. It is nearly certain that without U.S. aid, such countries as Greece, Turkey, Venezuela, El Salvador, Thailand, and South Korea would be communist today. America's overseas commitments have served another charitable purpose. They have prevented the outbreak of international Holocaust. In a century that has seen two catastrophic world wars, one coming only 20 years after the other, 40 years of peace in the Pax Americana, is no little accomplishment. All of this has taken an extraordinary amount of money, and the price of freedom is even higher in the face of a military buildup by the Soviet Union that rivals the Nazis of 1930. The U.S. does not currently have the military capacity to meet all its commitments around the world. The response of many people is that we have to scale back our commitments, even if that means allowing some countries to lose their freedom. The Reagan administration has answered the question differently. It will not send American troops to El Salvador or Nicaragua or Afghanistan, but it will unstintingly support people who want to fight on their own for their freedom. Page 12. Now there is little love for the Soviet Union among the American Jewish community. Not only do the Soviets persecute Jews within their own borders, the USSR is also the principal military supplier of Israel's most threatening enemies, Syria, the PLO, and Libya. But many Jews fault the Reagan administration and conservatives, more generally, for viewing social revolutions in the Third World as East-West conflicts. They believe that the Reagan rhetoric about freedom fighters is hollow, that the Contras of Nicaragua are no more than Somocista thugs, and that conservatives will gladly support dictators so long as they are anti-communist. I have two answers to this. The first is that the actual Reagan record on right-wing dictatorships is as good as any in American history. The Duvalier dynasty that tyrannized and fleeced Haiti began in 1957. It did not end under John F. Kennedy or Jimmy Carter. It ended under Ronald Reagan. The barbarous military dictatorships that afflicted Argentina, Uruguay, and Guatemala gave way to civilian rule during the Reagan administration, not the Carter administration. The most brutal carnage by death squads in El Salvador took place in 1980 under Jimmy Carter, and the number of killings has steadily fallen every year since Reagan took office. In fact, El Salvador had its first free elections in 50 years under Ronald Reagan. The Contras do not want to reimpose the Somoza dynasty, which, incidentally, began under Franklin Roosevelt. Page 13. The three top political leaders of the Contras were all involved in the revolution against Somoza. The recent ballot counting in the Philippines may have been fraudulent, but the Reagan administration has consistently insisted on fair elections, and if you think it is simply going to wink at the latest results, I suggest you wait and see what happens to Marcos in the next year. The Reagan administration well recognizes that democratic consent is a strong bulwark against communism, and that human rights overseas is in the United States' strategic interest. My second answer is that, nevertheless, the United States sometimes does have to ally itself with unsavory regimes or guerrilla movements in order to combat a greater evil. No one this century was as fierce and anti-Bolshevik as Winston Churchill. But Churchill sent aid to Stalin in 1941, after Hitler broke the non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. Churchill hated Stalin, but he simply recognized that the Nazis were then the single greatest threat to Western civilization and liberties. Priorities had to be kept straight. They still do. Today, the number one human rights priority must be to contain, and if possible roll back, Soviet military power. I say this for 3 reasons. 1. We Jews keep saying never again, never again. Well, we don't say it loud enough. There have been 4 genocidal holocausts in the last 10 years, and 3 have been in communist countries. Page 14. The first was in the killing fields of Cambodia, where between 2 million and 3 million people were ruthlessly slaughtered. Then came Afghanistan, where the Soviets have been deliberately depopulating the countryside, by such measures as pouring gasoline into caves and setting them afire, and by distributing toys that explode in children's hands. 5 million Afghans, 1/3 of the population, have fled their country. Now we have the man-made famine of Ethiopia, a deliberate effort to break the backs of the Tigrine and Wallo peoples, where trucks that could be used for delivering food are instead used in a massive resettlement program that has itself killed 100,000 people, according to relief workers. Apartheid may be reprehensible, but nothing the South African government has done in recent decades is as cruel to black Africans as the famine and resettlement program in Ethiopia. 2. Anti-communist dictatorships have a better chance of evolving into democracies than communist ones. Which is more likely to become democratic? Haiti or Cuba? South Korea or North Korea? The Philippines or Vietnam? Pakistan or Afghanistan? Within the last dozen years, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala have all become democratic. You cannot name a single communist country that has moved to democracy, except Grenada. 3. But the main reason why the Soviets are the biggest threat to human rights is that they have the arsenal to impose their system on others. Page 15. There is no danger that Ferdinand Marcos will impose his corrupt kleptocracy on other Asian countries, or that Chile's Pinochet will support guerrilla movements in Argentina and Peru. South Africa has no desire to export apartheid to Botswana and Mozambique, or even Namibia, where apartheid has been abolished. China ceased being a major threat to most of its neighbors in the late 1970s. By contrast, the Soviet Union is the only remaining imperial power in the world. It violates international law every day with its occupation of countries, ranging from the Ukraine to East Germany to Mongolia to Afghanistan. Soviet allies such as Cuba and Nicaragua train and arm guerrilla armies to subvert and terrorize the countries of Latin America. Any country taken over by Soviet-linked communists almost immediately becomes a threat to its neighbors. Any human rights policy must therefore have as one of its central emphases the prevention of communist takeovers and the prevention of the consolidation of communist power. I can talk only briefly about the 2 most controversial subjects, abortion and school prayer. Perhaps we can discuss these issues further in the question period. The Jewish tradition prohibits abortion in almost all circumstances, but it does permit the taking of a fetus's life if the mother's physical or mental health is seriously endangered. More recently, Jewish rabbinical organizations have taken the position that the decision about an abortion is a private choice that should be left to a woman and her doctor. Page 16. The overwhelming majority of American Jews subscribe to this position, men as well as women, devout religious observers as well as secularists, married as well as unmarried. This support for legal abortion cannot be attributed to an anti-family or antinatalist feeling. On the contrary, the most fervent Jewish supporters of abortion choice are men and women who take the responsibilities of child-rearing very seriously and believe it is best for the children if parenthood is carefully prepared for and consciously wanted. I have considerable sympathy for this argument, and, like many conservatives, I favor legal abortion in such circumstances as rape, incest, or any serious threat to a mother's life or health. As part of the honor that our civilization accords mothers, it is important for all of us to make sure that motherhood is a source of joy, not of pain and anguish. What bothers me, however, and what I think should bother everybody in the Jewish community, is that so many abortions occur in circumstances other than the ones I have just described. We Jews believe in the sanctity of life, the child's as well as the mother's. Well, last year there were 1.5 million abortions in this country. I think even those of us who think a mother and her doctor instead of the state should be making abortion decisions can agree that 1.5 million is too many, especially when there are long waiting lists of parents who want to adopt babies. Page 17. Too many abortions are taking place as a form of birth control. Too many are taking place for the convenience of the parents. Just because a practice is legal, and maybe should remain legal, does not mean it is right. Religion in the schools could be the subject of an entirely separate talk. Let me just say this. The Jews are a tolerant people, but I am afraid we have not been as tolerant as we ought to be when it comes to religion in the schools. We have been wedded to an abstraction, the total neutrality toward religion, allegedly mandated by the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Instead, what we should really be concerned about is ensuring an atmosphere of religious toleration and remaining eternally vigilant against any infringement of the rights of religious and other minorities. Thus, for example, it is entirely appropriate for Jews to object to organized vocal prayers in schools, where religious minorities might feel uncomfortable or even coerced into joining prayers that violate their families' faiths. It is also appropriate to object to proselytization by adults on school grounds. But it is difficult to imagine how the liberties of Jewish students or any other minorities are violated by a moment of silent prayer, or release time provisions, or allowing Bible clubs on school grounds after hours, or even by the singing of Christmas carols at a school assembly in a non-devotional way. Page 18. Toleration is a two-way street. It is simply unfair for religious minorities to demand accommodation from majorities, for example, not to be penalized for taking off Jewish holidays, if we cannot accommodate the expression of harmless religious sentiments by Christians. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.